At the time of Trump's election, some of you may have caught wind of a controversy in the U.S. architecture world. The American Institute of Architects, the leading professional organization for the field, came out with a statement saying that it was ready to work with President Trump to rebuild American infrastructure. And that prompted some immediate debates, criticisms, and backlash, because many of us recognized that to enlist in Trump's infrastructure project was to join a project of building white supremacy, of giving physical and spatial form and reinforcement to racial and other hierarchies that were integral to Trump's political platform and election. And so professional organizations, members of the AIA, groups like Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility pushed back against the profession's uncritical embrace of the new presidential agenda. And many of us in architectural education had the chance to weigh in on this in Archinect. And the talk I'm giving tonight tonight's talk has given me a chance to develop and flesh out a very short editorial I wrote at the time called Infrastructure Worth Building, that just was my kind of preliminary thoughts that I will develop further today. And so my presentation is going to have 3 chapters. The first is opening up this concept of building white supremacy a little more directly. The second, governing by design, this concept that Valentina alluded to that I have worked on for about a decade with colleagues in the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative. And then finally, infrastructure worth building. As the dean of an architecture school, I feel that every presentation must end on a optimistic, generative, forward-looking note. So as a historian, I'm used to, of course, looking backward and generating a kind of retrospective insight. But as an architectural educator and leader, academic leader, I always feel this imperative to highlight seeds of hope and to showcase what I think the generative, projective, and imaginative capacities of architects and urbanists and designers, what they have to contribute to political and social questions. One of the things that architects and scholars of the built environment contribute is to spatialize these biopolitical processes and help us understand the political economy of incarceration at both a general level and a granular scale. And schools are also enlisted in this building of white supremacy. So you probably are familiar with the concept of the school to prison pipeline. Our fellow architectural historian Amber Wiley wrote a short piece that I edited and published on the way the design of urban schools in the United States socializes youth of color into patterns of discipline and control that are intimately linked to the prisons that some of them will be incarcerated in subsequent to graduation. And this is not a field I'm deeply knowledgeable about, but even in a city like New York, with a long history of liberal and progressive governance, the school systems are much more segregated than the neighborhoods they draw from. And so they draw young people into racialized patterns of inequality, disparate experience, and just disparate outcomes. And then finally, something I'll talk about in a little bit more depth, our very houses also are part of building racial inequalities. And I've looked at this mostly through the lens of mortgage financing. I'll touch on this a little bit. I'll circle back to this in a later part of the presentation as well. But I think most of us are used to thinking of a mortgage as the loan you take out in order to be able to buy the house that you want to live in. But in contemporary capitalism, for many middle-class homeowners, the house is the collateral with which to secure a loan. In other words, I think at some level, for many middle-class people in a neoliberal era of diminished job security, health precarity, and the need to be responsible for one's own retirement income, one of the motivations for buying a house is to invest in the real estate market on borrowed money. And so some of my work has focused on the intimate relationship between the design and consumption of houses and their role in the financial, in the credit markets and in the financialization of neoliberal life. And so in doing that work on mortgage-financed home ownership and the way it intersects with architecture, I became familiar with some of the work about racial capitalism and the financialization of race by authors like George Lipsitz and others. I particularly have appreciated the contribution of Ta-Nehisi Coates to this conversation. In his long essay series, The Case for Reparations, published a couple of years ago in The Atlantic, he outlined the racialization of home ownership and mortgage finance in linking it to Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery in a very elegant way that touched on familiar concepts like redlining, disparate access to capital, to borrowing based on neighborhoods that were already sorted by class and race, and also to histories, less familiar histories, like that of this organization, the Contract Buyers League, which was a group of Chicago residents in the 1950s and 60s who organized to fight back against predatory lending practices that made it, that gave African American homeowners or home buyers, it gave them access to mortgage loans only under the most punitive conditions that ended up often leaving borrowers with lots of debt and a foreclosed upon house. So Coates reconstructed the extent to which mortgage financing was a primary instrument of not only sustaining segregation, but then victimizing African Americans who challenged that regime and were, even when they were successful at buying into predominantly white neighborhoods, it often ended up undermining their financial viability. So that history of differential access to home ownership and to the credit or the borrowing capacity that makes home ownership possible is a big part of what has produced the wealth gap between African American populations and white people in the United States. The easiest way to get an appetizer-sized portion is to go on the aggregate website and to read this essay of mine called Risk Design. It's a close reading of the Gherkin, the Swiss rebuilding, or 30 St. Mary Axe in London. The Detroit Institute of Arts was at one point kind of collateral for the city of Detroit's pension obligations and became a kind of architectural territory of negotiation over governance and authority in Detroit's great automotive city. Some of the infrastructures that are most central to life, experience, and finance and sovereignty today are built into these devices, right? They are digital platforms that are driving economic change and political change. And so Keller Easterling, with a group of collaborators, imagined an alternative online platform designed to facilitate bartering and exchange of ideas, resources, and help among agents and entities, irrespective of locale, of geography, of citizenship, of nation. And so they imagined this online platform that would allow these multilateral exchanges of people who are not necessarily place-bound. They might be migrants, they might be refugees, they might be global nomads, people who are not interested in doubling down on geographically bounded notions of sovereignty and citizenship, but instead are interested in crossing over. And so they imagined, this is the cell phone screen. I'll use my fancy pointer and see if I can get it to work. There we go. So that's the cell phone screen that is the imagined interface linking people of many different kinds in these global exchanges. And not featured in the Dimensions of Citizenship show, but very present in this conversation, is the work of Ron Rael at Berkeley, whose glorious book, Border Wall as Architecture, came out in, I think, 2017, reflecting on the Mexico-US boundary in a variety of ways. So Rael documented and analyzed the border and the existing methods of fencing and enclosure that regulate it. He also gathered some design proposals of his own and by others that imagine alternative border infrastructures. So this is one example, the Biblioteca library that crosses the border and allows book exchanges across this national boundary, or the theater that the border fence would run right through and allow an audience of Mexican and U.S. residents to watch a movie together, even if they couldn't cross over. He looks at the whimsical and humorous ways that people have played with the border, like this human cannonball guy. And then Ron came up with some of his own propositions, like this seesaw border fence that would activate, that would sort of make play out of this most sinister of edifices, or the xylophone wall. And he has a little passage about xylophobia instead of xenophobia. So I think this is maybe a good example. All of these projects, right, are examples of the projective and imaginative capacity of architects and designers. Even if we don't control the resources or the political authority to change the physical facts of the border between the US and Mexico, we can certainly refuse to lend our expertise to Trump's endeavor, but we can also use our generative capacity to imagine alternative worlds and alternative futures that might help people think and act in different ways. Liberty Plaza, the liberated Zuccotti Park, and with some colleagues made these drawings capturing the creation of a little micro-urbanism and self-governing community in this city park in New York. And my interest in it started with the way that Occupy emerged out of a critique of financialized homeownership and financialized education, the debt burden of students and homeowners. And things like this 99% project, which enlisted social media for people to tell their stories of foreclosure and of debt. A little bit of a counterpoint to those happy home flippers and home renovators that I showed before. And I became very interested in that dimension of Occupy, the reclaim our homes or Occupy foreclosure aspect of the movement. And so my colleague and I, we reconstructed, we interpreted the governance, the sovereignty of Occupy Wall Street in relation to the physical layout of Zuccotti Park, the affordances that it provided as a platform for community building, and the way the camp, the architecture, the temporary architecture and urbanism of the camp actually intersected with its politics and its self-governance. So we started out, with this kind of corporate plaza designed for office workers to eat their lunch in passive recreation. We diagrammed the way private ownership versus city ownership established boundaries for the experiment of Occupy Wall Street. We looked at how the two faucets and the many electrical outlets created a set of affordances that shaped where things went in the plaza. We looked at the way prevailing winds, sun exposure, traffic noise, construction dust from the World Trade Center site inflected that built geography of the plaza with another set of environmental factors. And then we correlated that with the emergence of nuclei of activity in particular parts of the plaza. And we noted the way a kind of functional zoning emerged within this extremely small parcel, partly, as different groups kind of clustered and appropriated the plaza based on the placement of a retaining wall or the wind protection afforded by a planter, the favorable solar exposure of a particular corner of pavement. And so we looked at the emergence of a functionally zoned urbanism, microurbanism on the plaza, and how that interacted with the mode of self-governance that the camp set up. And then we also looked at surveillance, policing, media exposure. We went through and one afternoon and did a survey and a body count and sort of recorded the densities and positions and types of people we encountered in this sweep through the plaza. As fall set in, we looked at the kinds of enclosures that started to inflect the camp. And finally, we documented it after the police forcibly cleared the plaza and understood its last iteration as a space of renewed state authority. We also correlated the in the city and in the streets activity with things going on in online platforms, social media, websites, and so forth. And we correlated a little bit the governance deliberations that were happening on online forums with those that were happening in the face-to-face forum of Zuccotti Park. And finally, I became very interested in these crowd maps that the movement used to share information and to record its geography and to shape its geography, which of course intersect with Google Maps and Trulia and Zillow, GIS, real estate databases, and became part of the anti-foreclosure movement. So the last kind of infrastructure worth building, I hope in the last few examples you've gotten a sense of some moments of prefigurative politics, let's say, or of alternative, the formation of counterpublics or alternative modes of self-governance. I get very excited about those things as prefigurations of a potentially larger transformation. The last thing I want to touch on, because I am a dean and an architectural educator, one of the infrastructures worth building is a profession that serves justice. And so a lot of my work these days is about building the coalitions and the practices in architectural education and practice, the profession, that will be more equitable in all kinds of ways. So I extended my Black Lives Matter work to a teach-in at California College of the Arts with students and faculty colleagues. There are, I consider myself an ally of groups like Black in Design that are translating that into more institutional structures. I talked already about architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility who have issued a boycott, called on the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, to revise its code of ethics to prohibit its members from designing prisons and incarceration facilities and migrant detention camps. Colleagues in urban planning at UCLA, my alma mater, issued this abolitionist planning manifesto to suggest ways that they and their colleagues should divest from white supremacy in their work. My colleagues and I partnered with disability studies and LGBT studies and women's studies at Michigan, as well as Yale School of Architecture last year, to produce a symposium on universal design, starting with transgender inclusive restrooms, and then opening that out into a broader conversation about ability and access in the built environment. There's a huge conversation about gender inequities in architecture. And so I work with people in a group called Equity by Design that is really aimed at looking intersectionally at the different success rates and outcomes for different kinds of people in the architecture profession. And as an architectural educator, one of my obligations is to help provide a learning environment free of sexual harassment. So the Shitty Architecture Men list and some of the other anti-sexual harassment movements are front and center in my consciousness and my work with colleagues. And then finally, one group that brings a lot of these topics together is the Architecture Lobby, a network of mostly young professionals and academics and students who are scrutinizing the labor practices and the economics of architectural practice and drawing on histories of unionization or collective ownership or cooperative practice in order to suggest ways that we make a less exploitive professional world for ourselves